Hey guys, so it's been a long while since I did a deep dive into gaming segment, and while in terms of setup it's not how it would have been, I feel comfortable doing it this way rather than doing it straightly towards the game wall and stuff like that. Actually, I don't mind it really, but that being said, I'm going to go ahead and do a deep dive into gaming segment. For those that aren't familiar with this is where I normally talk about a previous game or game that I've currently played and talk about my internal thoughts about it and everything like that. And with this one, I want to take a continuation from where I did my Final Fantasy deep dive into gaming. And instead of talking about the rest of them, I'm talking about it in sections. Obviously, with this one, we're going to be talking about the PlayStation 1 era of Final Fantasy, being that of Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 8, and Final Fantasy 9. So first off, let's go ahead and first talk about Final Fantasy 7. Now, when I first played it, this was right after I played through Final Fantasy X, and I was just like absolutely enjoying every moment of Final Fantasy VII, really. I absolutely enjoyed it. But that was at a time where I hadn't had much exposure of different RPGs, different games and stuff like that. And of course, this was at a time where I hadn't played many Final Fantasy games. I only played like one, which was FF10, obviously. So Final Fantasy VII was literally the second Final Fantasy game that I had played. So my thoughts back then do not match the thoughts that I have for this game today. Much like with 8 and 9, obviously, and much of everything else. But I do feel like I want to go ahead and kind of give you brief notes about what I felt towards 7. And those are that the gameplay, pretty much just like any Final Fantasy game from that point, it was turn-based. It was still a really good Final Fantasy game. In terms of the internal different abilities and stuff, which is the materia system, I still absolutely love the materia system. The fact that each materia, you can level it up and you get a more powerful spell or a different spell in general, like for example heal, and then you got like a noose, which heals all different elements. You also have the fact that you got fire, and then upgrades to fire up, and then fire ga. You then also have the different summon materia. And probably one of the coolest things about the materia system is that as you max them out, when you max out their star, they basically make a duplicate, which is interesting to see that. I completely forgot about the fact that, if you master a materia, you get a duplicate of that same materia that you had, which makes it that much more unique. And I really do enjoy trying to get all the different materials, even to a point where I still enjoy getting the nice round. But the funny thing was, as a kid, I actually enjoyed it doing the chocobo breeding just to get the nice round. However, though, knowing that there is actually a trick to getting the gold chocobo, you would only have to do the race technically once. When you think about it, you only have to do the race once. But after that, it's just a matter of mix and matching different types of chocobos in order to get closer to the gold chocobo. So I was so used, as a kid, I was used to the idea that you had to max every chocobo to S rank, and then thus you could breed them in order to get a guaranteed of either green or blue or black, and thus gold, obviously. And it's one of those things where it's like, I wish I had known this a little bit better. At the same time, I didn't think about, doing the whole like save and then retry again, save, retry again, turn off, turn back on, try it again type thing, resetting it. I was so more or less used to the idea of like continuously working hours on end just to get that particular set to work, And it's one of those things where it just, I didn't think that way. But it's kind of a nicer to know that I don't have to go through hours on end going through the same chocobo race just to get a gold chocobo. It is kind of nice to know that I don't have to go through that ordeal. But everything else, though, from getting the ultimate weapon to getting the materials, I think is the fun part of Final Fantasy VII. Fighting the super bosses like Emerald and Ruby weapon, not so much. Like, I can't stress it enough. I absolutely... I thought I remember clearly years ago whenever I was trying to complete Final Fantasy VII for the first time, I actually did beat Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon. And it's just weird of how I couldn't do the same strategy and it just wouldn't work for some reason. I don't know why. But I remember specifically whenever I had the nice little round and I would use the Time 2 ability, Materia, and when I used it, it used it twice. But for some reason, it just was not working to kill it. You know, apparently they have that much more HP, and I thought I beat them, but apparently I may not have. I mean, I beat them, but I was doing it with the inability cheat code that they have implemented in the game, like max attack, max HP, and all that stuff. So it's one of those things where it's like, I kind of cheated, so it doesn't really count that I beat it, but I did beat it. My mind says I've beaten it, but I know technically it's more or less cheating. It's like, I cheated! Cheated! And all that stuff. But overall, in terms of gameplay, Final Fantasy VII is a really good game. In terms of story, it's not as great as what it was when I first played it. There was a lot of stuff that I was confused at. You know, it's like you play a game once and you think it's really good. You play it multiple times when you're a kid and you think it's really good still. Then you play it years later only to realize that you have a better sense of an idea of what the story is and stuff like that, and you have a better understanding. The problem is that Final Fantasy VII tries to stay at a mystery story. I don't know if you know the origin or not, but originally Final Fantasy VII had a different story element of where you were technically a detective. And in this case, they try to keep the same ideal of mystery, but instead it's sort of a flip-flop of emotions. And I think that's the best way to explain it, is that it is mostly mixed emotions that Cloud is going through. And it's like he's kind of confused as to who he really is. And the reality is, it's not that he should be confused, it's just the game at the time that the story was made was trying to confuse the audience, the player itself. And so it's one of those things where it's like, unless you have all of the previous pieces, therefore the story kind of jumbles itself to a realm of confusion, really, when you think about it. And to kind of explain it better, you know, Cloud is not a member of Soldier. He is technically a member of Shinra, but he's not a member of Soldier. And the difference is that soldiers are more or less genetically enhanced beings that were enhanced to become more powerful soldiers, obviously, like Zack Fair was. And that's basically the thing, that Zack was a better character in Crisis Core, and he sacrificed himself in order to help Cloud and protect him and everything like that. And unfortunately, Cloud carried on his lineage as Zack, but instead he carried it through Cloud. That seems confusing from that standpoint, but that's basically the beginning part of the story, that Cloud is taking on a role as Soldier First Class. And the story goes on from there, but then there's like a little bit of twists and turns as to how these different characters coexist. For example, technically Vincent knows the true mother of Sephiroth, even though Sephiroth looks at Jenova as a mother, but instead Sephiroth was a successful genetically enhanced child with Jenova cells. And because of Hojo, who is the father of Sephiroth, pretty much fucked with him pretty badly. Actually, it was not just him, it was also Genesis, but that only if you remember Crisis Core. Which, from what people are saying, apparently all the previous Final Fantasy installments do not chronologically count towards the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is absolute bullshit, I think. You know, it's like, you know, Dresden Cerberus was good, Advent Children was good, Crisis Core was good, so overall it was really good. But I think that's a problem in Final Fantasy VII's case, is that unless you include those different sequels and prequels, 7 kind of leaves itself a little bit hanging, you know, especially how it ends. And it's one of those things where it's like, maybe if it was thought as to like not having sequels and prequels, because Final Fantasy is its own series. You know, it has different stories and stuff, and none of them are connected to each other. Yeah, it's fun to kind of theorize as to, like, Final Fantasy X could be connected to 7, or Final Fantasy IV could be connected to, like, 8, or some silly theory that people tend to come up with and stuff like that. But it's never really relevant to say that they are literally connected, you know what I mean? So I think Final Fantasy should do better to not try to make sequels and prequels. It shouldn't leave gaps, and instead the main series needs to be a whole story in its entirety. You know, if it feels like it needs to fill them in, then do like a side quest in the main game involving you discovering a small portion of the story, explaining like the character's origin or some other detail that was never put into the main plot of the story. So in terms of story element, I have a better understanding of 7. Doesn't mean I don't appreciate it that much more. I still do, but in terms of story, I felt like it could probably do a little bit better. Really, it could have. Now let's go to Final Fantasy VIII. Now, years ago when I first played 8 was more or less a Final Fantasy game that I, at the time, hated. I actually despised 8. And it was only because at the time I didn't understand the mechanic that was Final Fantasy VIII. I didn't understand the mechanic at the time. But after playing through 8 and everything like that, I actually have a better understanding of 8. And I think 8's a little bit better than what most people would think. In fact, in my personal opinion, I think 8 is actually a more deserving Final Fantasy game than most people give it credit for. It does have its problems, I will admit that, but overall is not as big of a deal as every other Final Fantasy game usually has a small problem. The problem is through its junctions. Now, I say the problem is through its junctions because the biggest thing is that if you know anything about Final Fantasy VIII with its junctions, is that Final Fantasy VIII does magic spells attached to your different stats. In other words, that's where your majority of your different stat increase come from, is through these different spells. For example, if you attach fire onto your HP, it gives it a little bit of boost. And the more you have of fire spells, you will have a higher amount of stat increase added on to it. Whereas if you had Fire Ga, which is a more powerful spell, and the more Fire Ga you have, the more outstanding of a stat it can deliver in terms of level up. Not in terms of leveling up per se, but your stats increase with the added on junction of your fire enhanced spells. Now, of course, the funny thing is that the most powerful spell in the game is Ultima. And Ultima delivers a outstandingly insane stat increase. And especially so if you have 99 Ultima spells stacked up. Your stat will level up that much more. So what's interesting is that technically Final Fantasy VIII has a weird hidden gimmick that it has. I say weird hidden gimmick is that you wouldn't know it unless you actually bought a strategy guide or someone told you. And that was the fact that in Final Fantasy VIII, the enemies as well as bosses, their HP as well as their stat level up with yours. So that's the weird thing, is that technically you don't have to level up in this game at all. You don't have to level up. In fact, I would argue with the fact that technically, by the time you get to have the first Guardian Force you get, which is Quizilla, I believe, it's the Lightning Elemental Guardian. One of his abilities is Card. Now what it does is that it transforms an enemy into a card. However, though, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can just draw spells from different enemies and then run away from them. I imagine that's probably the course of action that you could probably take. And that's how the majority of the enemies as well as bosses don't overpower you. Is so that way you don't level up and just, instead of leveling up, you attain spells from different enemies and you can stack them on your junctions. There is, however, one other problem, and I hadn't really looked into it myself, and that's the fact that different guardians give out different abilities, and you want those different abilities to help enhance your combat abilities. And for example, there are some guardians that don't have all of the junctions that you need, and certain guardians give out certain particular parts of junctions that you would want to equip to. For example, you would want some kind of a guardian to enhance your attack and defense, but also you may want a guardian that enhances your HP as well, depending on what type of maneuver you usually go for in an RPG game. And I know some people will be like, well, what would happen if you used a spell? That does actually decrease your stats, which means the more spells you use that's already equipped to your junction, the less stat benefit you get in the long run. So in other words, you have to keep absorbing different spells from different enemies just to keep up with the junction. And that's kind of not so much of a fail, but so much as a misconception, double-edged sword that people forget, I think, what it is. Thankfully, though, there are different junctions, again, going back to the different abilities from different guardians, there are different abilities in which where you can transform those different weaker spells into stronger enhanced spells. So, and then there's also some abilities where they change items into different spells as well. So again, it's very heavily enhanced when it comes to the junction, and if done right, if played the game done right, you could actually have an easier time beating Final Fantasy VIII. And I think that's where the genius comes in, but at the same time, that's where it kind of fails in that area as well, is the junction part of Final Fantasy VIII. It's not bad. I do enjoy it a lot better than I did when I first played it, but the junction is that kind of wall barrier that kind of prevents people from enjoying 8 a little bit more than it could have. You know, the characters are really good. Squall himself is actually a more representative character in the game itself. I do enjoy Squall. The story is actually unique, and if you can kind of get used to the whole flip-flop of time manipulation, it's not as confusing, you know. Unlike most time traveling games these days, some of them are a little bit more overhead confusion. In this case, the story is a little bit more simplistic to understand. It's not so much manipulating time, it's so much going through time to see events of what was happening and stuff like that, up until the end, in which where your group basically travels forward through time to beat the ultimate evil, and then for some reason you accidentally get thrown a little bit further back in time than you should be, in which where you saw the events actually leading up to the current event that was happening in the game itself. So at the end of the day, Final Fantasy VIII is a little bit better of a game. I would argue with the fact that the junctions could have done a little bit better, but it could be done. Final Fantasy VIII is and could be an enjoyable Final Fantasy game for anyone. Alright, now let's talk about Final Fantasy IX. Now, I remember enjoying Final Fantasy IX a little bit more than 8, and I thought maybe it's because of how bad 8 was at the time that made me enjoy Final Fantasy IX. Because keep in mind, I stopped playing Final Fantasy VIII halfway through, and then I picked up 9, played it, beat it, jumped back into 8 to try to finish it. In this case, I played through 8 and beat it, and then I played through 9, and I think I enjoy it a little bit more than I cared to admit. So, I think what it is that I think it's the overall equality that the game actually has. For example, number one, the graphic tone of Final Fantasy VIII is somewhat of a, I wouldn't say chibi form, but they kind of have that mini form look to them. When you think about it, they have that kind of like mini form structure to them. I'm not going to say that it was completely miniature, but it looks miniature, especially when you compare Sidon to that of like Squall. The size doesn't match up, and yet Squall is somehow the same height as almost every other character just about. So they seem to kind of be shrunk people, if you will. But I do kind of like the art style that they have with. I do love the story that it has. The story is, I think, way more enjoyable in this one. It does have like a different chapter section, if you will, whereas like the first part of the game is where you're having to deal with the queen who has been manipulated by greed. Then you have the second segment where you have to deal with like this other world segment that is happening and being forced into. And then you have this third chapter where you have this outer region that is nearly impossible to reach. So it's like you have this like different segment, and it's like growing steadily into more of an insane element, and it's not hard to keep track, really. That's the weird thing, is that it kind of does a good job of keeping track with how it's telling the story and stuff like that. And I do love all the characters. I love Sidon, I love Garnet, I love Steiner. But of course, I think everyone can agree with me, the favorite character of Final Fantasy IX is Vivi. Absolutely wonderful. And the weird thing is that Vivi's persona matches somewhat like that of Delmar, my brother. He has that kind of same personality where he doubts himself a lot, but sometimes he tries to figure out how to work it in and stuff like that, you know? It's one of those things where it's like, he doesn't know fully what's happening, but at the same time, he has to try to figure out in his own way how to work around it, or how to even work with it and stuff like that. And Vivi's just learning how his life interacts with the actual law of life itself. You know, he's starting to realize that technically him stopping is the result of him dying perchance. And that ideal thought of death scares him almost, and it does for everyone. But it's kind of that persona where he overcomes that fear and he becomes a stronger person at the end of the day. And every character goes through that, you know? They go through the fear that they have of losing someone, and at the same time they end up overcoming that thought by pushing through and trying to protect the one that they care the most. It has a really wonderful message, really it does. And I really do enjoy Final Fantasy IX. The bosses are actually the fun part in this one. I do love the bosses because depending on if it's like the main story boss, they have like a little in-scene story to them. Sort of like how Final Fantasy V did, where it had like a kind of like a semi-fourth wall breaking moment, if you will, where they had like a little story preference and stuff in the battle itself. And it was pretty interesting. I do like that. The summons are really good. I do love the summons. I do love, however, the main concept core of Final Fantasy IX, and that's through getting abilities. Now, the way you get different abilities in this game is by equipping a particular weapon or armor or accessory, and if you equip it long enough and wait for the bar to fill up and master it, you get to keep that ability from then on out. Record, that does take ability points, but depending on your overall ability points and stuff like that, you actually can keep up with the build that can be immune to certain stat elements, which is really good to have. They can be more powerful against certain enemies like dragons, bugs, undead, and stuff like that, which is very helpful. And some of them are more or less some enhanced abilities. For example, your enhanced ability of being able to cast spells or healing elements and stuff like that. And some of them are just really, really good abilities that you would want to have right then and there in the long term of things, you know, like increased guild capacity, increased, I think one of them was like increased experience that you get and stuff. So overall, Final Fantasy IX is a really good balanced RPG, I think. Really it is. It's a really good balanced RPG. It does have like a small problem. I think if I had to point it out, it would be the fact that technically speaking, I don't know. I can't seem to find a flaw. I just like 9 that much, but I can't seem to find a flaw. With 7, over time, I do actually find the flaw, which is the story. And 8 is the junction. 9, I don't think there's a flaw in it. I actually kind of like how everything works together, you know? I think it does a good job of keeping everything well checked in terms of story, in terms of your abilities, in terms of weapons and items and stuff, I think it does a really good job. So I don't think there is anything that I have to complain about Final Fantasy IX, really. I don't think there is. So, yeah, I think Final Fantasy IX is like one of the more better games out there that's been out in terms of Final Fantasy, you know? So yeah, there you go. That is my deep dive into gaming in regards to Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9. So hopefully later on I will be putting out a different video for you guys in terms of deep dive into gaming. I'm going to try to do more video projects. It's been kind of a while since I've been doing a lot more videos, and I've been kind of out of it for a couple of weeks. But hopefully I'll be able to do more later on, and hopefully I'll do another deep dive into gaming, in which case you'll get to enjoy me rambling about the game that I either enjoy, hate, or I just recently played. So, with that being said, thank you so much guys for watching, and I shall see you in the next one. Take care guys.